I always try to make sure if I have good advice, I put it right up front so you don't have to slog through the entire video to get it, which I realize makes me an outlier on YouTube, but I don't care. If you want to skip this video, just go buy this book, The Book of Challenges from 3rd edition. It's on the DM's Guild. The encounters in here they're like traps, but they are better than traps. You'll see. They will dramatically improve your adventures. You're welcome. On with the show. Lots of folks ask, can you do a video on traps? Almost 100 videos and I haven't covered traps yet because traps occupy this weird space in the game. Unlike fighting monsters, traps aren't really part of the game in any significant way, and that tells us a lot right there. The rules don't present traps as a real feature. There's not much to interact with. Make a roll to see if you notice the trap, make another roll to see if you can disarm it. And by the way, disarming traps isn't a rule in 5th edition. There's no mechanism related to traps. There's no disarm trap action listed anywhere in the book. It's just something you can try to do. Anybody can try it. If you have the right tools, you get a proficiency bonus. If you're a certain kind of rogue, you can do it as a bonus action, and there's this one spell people rarely take. So the player's handbook acknowledges that traps exist, but they give you almost no tools to deal with them. What does the DM's guide say? It's got a little bit more info, but it's sort of a cop-out. The DM's guide says that all the rules for detecting and disarming a trap and what kind of complications it might have will be described in the trap. In other words, unlike monsters, which use hit points and armor class and stats and saving throws, all of these mechanics described in the player's handbook, traps have no mechanics. If you want to make a complex trap that gives the players lots of different ways to interact with it and different success states and different failure states and different effects, you're on your own. You have to invent all that stuff on a trap-by-trap basis. Okay, so what this means is the game's not about traps. If you encounter one, it's 2 rolls. Did you notice it? Did you disarm it? Move on. You might think, well, that sucks. My fantasy of D&D involves exploring ancient ruins and being careful, and that interacting with ancient, complex, deadly traps is part of that game. But in reality, it's never been any better than it is now. Traps have always been boutique content. In fact, we would routinely end up in a situation when we detected a trap but had failed to disarm it, and now the players and the DM are sitting around wondering what happens. Does failing to disarm trigger the trap? If not, then what? Usually the DM would have to improvise details about the trap to satisfy the player's desire to make forward progress after a failed roll. And then those details would turn out to be logically impossible or contradictory, because obviously the DM is making it up, and now everybody is frustrated. And the DM has to invent all that detail on the fly because the trap described in the adventure, and we're talking about adventures over, 40 years of the hobby and 5 or 6 or 7 different editions of the game. They have almost no detail. So the DM has to make up a bunch of nonsense at the spur of the moment. If you want to invent a new monster, it's easy. There are all these rules monsters already use, so you're not starting from scratch every time you decide to create one. And the monster it's fun to interact with. Traps have never had this kind of rigor. 3rd edition tried to systematize them, but either the design wasn't compelling or it just wasn't what people wanted. Maybe most folks want designing traps to be this bespoke boutique experience. I think some folks can imagine an entire system for trap design as like a mini game for detecting and disarming them. It's easy to imagine a system like that, but once you sit down to try to design it, you usually find that all you're doing is making the game more tedious. And this is why I don't think traps have ever really been a feature of the game the way monsters are. So if we're stuck with traps as this kind of one-off boutique experience, we can at least talk about what role traps play in the game. I think there's basically 4 kinds of traps. Some traps just act like a test. Are the heroes being careful? If yes, then they pass the test. If no, then the trap will sting you somehow. These traps don't debilitate you, they just remind you that the world is a dangerous place. Like the pressure plate trap in the Delian Tomb. Remember this? This is the original adventure I made back when we started the series. There's a pressure plate here, and if you step on it, it releases a scythe on a pendulum which will swing down and ruin your day. That's it. That's the whole trap. I didn't say what the DC was to detect it or even how much damage the scythe did because I wanted the DM to have to come up with something that made sense to them. Because I think it's important for new DMs to start developing those muscles. Why did I put this trap here? I don't know. I didn't really think about it. I just figured, well, at this point they've dealt with a goblin patrol and the goblins who live in here. Time to mix it up. Let's have a trap. It feels classic, but what is the point of it? Well, it does break up the monotony of just dealing with more goblins, but it can also work to remind the players that this place, the tomb they're in, has its own character, its own history, apart from the goblins who live here. The goblins didn't build this place. So yes, it works to teach the players that the world is dangerous and they should proceed with caution, even when there aren't any goblins around, but it also reminds the players of the tomb and the people who built it. And I think that has value. It makes the tomb more interesting. It's not just a bucket of goblins, it has its own character. And I think that's good adventure design. You have the design of the place, which is one thing, and it's got its own purpose and history. And then there's what is happening now, which might not have anything to do with that. Two stories from two different eras sitting right on top of each other. But there's a little more to it than that. If the players don't tread carefully and the scythe gets them, then they have some choices to make. Do they stop and rest to regain some hit points? Is it safe to stop here? Should they use some spells to heal their injured comrade? Can they afford to drain some resources? And if they decide it's fine, we're all fine down here, how are you? Then when they end up in the final battle, they are starting at a deficit. Someone's wounded. And during the fight against the Bugbear Chieftain, they will think back to that trap and curse it and themselves for not searching, not stopping, and healing. And this is super important. The trap doesn't just wound a player, it creates this decision point. And there is no right answer. If they stop and rest, another patrol might get them and soften them up more. If they heal, they might need those spells in the final battle. If they press on. Now, a monster encounter in the same room would have created the same effect, but when monsters hurt you, you blame the monsters. When traps hurt you, you blame yourself. That is a huge difference, and it's probably why I like traps. If I were going to give this trap some stats, I would probably make it easy to notice if the players announce they're proceeding with caution. I'm not super picky about how they proceed. As long as they indicate in some way they are being careful, I will give them a chance to notice it. But then I want this trap to really wound someone, like take half their hit points away. It needs to be something that makes them stop and think. So that's one use for traps. Another is to ratchet up the drama in a tense moment. For instance, in the Castle Rend adventure, Phil's character, Graves, was trying to sneak into the castle at one point, and it's in the middle of a big forest, but the orcs have cleared out all the trees within 100 feet of the castle. So it's really hard to sneak up on the castle without the orcs noticing. Well, Phil is a warlock, and I think he had invisibility, so he feels like he can just walk across the clearing, bold as brass. He is not proceeding with caution, and so he doesn't notice the fact that this one patch of grass in front of him is slightly different than the surrounding grass, and he falls into a pit trap. This does some damage to him, and that's good. It's a new problem to deal with, but it also ratchets up the drama, because now Phil is worried the orcs will notice their trap worked. Suddenly, there's a ticking clock. Can he get out of the pit and into the keep before the orcs on patrol notice the trap was sprung? That trap took one scenario. Can I cross this clearing without the orcs noticing? Which is, it's basically just stealth versus perception, and turn it into another kind of scenario. Now time is a factor. A ticking clock makes everything better. So that shows how a trap can take one scenario and turn it into another scenario by adding drama. And by the way, it shows that the orcs are smart and they're thinking. The monsters, as my friend Jordy likes to say, want to win. Third, traps can be used in addition to a normal monster encounter to make things way, way nastier than the players thought. One of my favorite traps is actually in the Moat House dungeon in the village of Hamlet. There's a corridor in the dungeon with a portcullis or a huge iron gate that will slam down from the ceiling. But here's the thing. It never explains why. Like, okay, an iron gate slams down. So what? How is this an encounter? It's crazy, but I think the community of D&D was so narrow and uniform back then that it would have been obvious to anyone in 1979 what was supposed to happen. I ran this dungeon 4 or 5 times over 30 years before I finally figured it out. The players walk down the corridor, they don't notice the portcullis, it slams down, cutting the 2 heroes in front off from the rest of the party. Then some bugbears from deeper in the dungeon show up and attack those 2 players. The other party members can only watch, maybe fire some arrows. Then, after maybe a round or 2, more bugbears come around and attack the PCs on the other side of the iron gate. As soon as I did this, I realized, this is what the portcullis trap is for. Divide and conquer. The bugbears are smart, and they've been down here for a while. They've had time to set up defenses like this. This happened to Lars and Anna's group. It was super memorable, forcing them to think outside the box. I think, as a rule, good adventurers allow the players to use all of their abilities in the final battle. That is epic and part of what makes it fun. But in smaller encounters like this, we need to break things up. We need to use traps like this to limit the player's ability to bring all of their force to bear. Otherwise, the only encounters that are challenging are the final battle. So you can use traps to remind the players a location can be dangerous without any monsters, and they should proceed with caution. You can use traps to ratchet up the drama in a scenario the players thought they had a handle on. And you can use traps in a monster encounter to split up the party so the heroes can't bring all their force to bear. Finally, some traps are famous for being an entire encounter on their own. One of my favorites is from this book, which I highly recommend, The Book of Challenges from 3rd edition. My favorite trap in here presents a corridor with a T intersection, so you can use it in any dungeon or temple or any building, really. The players reach the intersection, and if somebody walks out into the corridor, a portcullis drops down, separating them from the rest of the party. Divide and conquer, right? If they look left, they see a lever, which they will assume, and I ran this trap and they did assume it, will lift the portcullis. Great. So they run down there and run into the gelatinous cube filling that side of the corridor. It's transparent, so they could see the lever through it. The poor hero unsticks themselves from the gelatinous cube, and in desperation, as their friends try to lift the portcullis, they run in the opposite direction toward a door. I added this door, but it worked well. With the gelatinous cube slowly advancing behind them, they try the door only to realize it is a false door and the handle opens a pit trap underneath them. They fall into the trap, they are impaled on the spikes at the bottom, and then, as they think about how to deal with this, the gelatinous cube appears at the top of the pit and then falls onto the pit on top of them. So now they are at the bottom of the pit, impaled on spikes, being digested by a gelatinous cube. This is my all-time favorite trap, and it's in this book, and it does involve a monster, but it is not about the monster. I don't think of it as a monster encounter. I think of it like a trap. That's what this book is about. I think challenge is a good term for it. It's more than a trap, but it's not a simple monster encounter. It's a different kind of beast. You can see how this book continues to inspire me in the Chain of Acheron campaign. I used a mimic and a gelatinous cube to create this awesome Rube Goldberg encounter where things just got progressively more complex and ridiculous and sticky. By the way, Rube Goldberg was an artist. He drew comic panels for the newspapers in the early 20th century, and his art often featured these elaborate machines with many silly moving parts that were very complex and surprising and funny, designed to do something incredibly simple and mundane. So when someone says a Rube Goldberg device, they mean something comically complex. There's a point in these great encounters where the players go, "You gotta be kidding me." That's when you know it's awesome. So check out the Book of Challenges. It's for 3rd edition, but I think most of it adapts pretty easily to 5e. There's also a famous series of books from Flying Buffalo called Grimtooth's Traps. I bring them up here because even though I never used them, a lot of folks love them. There's a link to all these in the doobly-doo. I've never used Grimtooth's because to me, they are too explicitly ridiculous, better suited to a Funhouse dungeon. Like the canonical Grimtooth's trap is a corridor with an open pit filled with spikes. There's a rope hanging down from the ceiling tied to a post on your side of the pit. The players see the rope and the pit and they figure they can use the rope to swing over the pit. When they do, they discover the rope goes into the ceiling, and instead of swinging over the pit, the rope just spools out from a hidden compartment in the ceiling, and you slam into the wall on the other side of the pit and then fall into the spikes. That is too ridiculous for me. Unless that is the point of your game, I can have a lot of fun as a player in a game like this, especially in a tournament at a convention. But unless I'm running a Funhouse dungeon, I don't find these to my taste. A lot of Grimtooth's traps are predicated on the idea that ancient high-level wizards were basically gods who could easily create impossible things, materials to make these traps out of that don't normally exist in D&D, like frictionless floors and whatnot. They can be fun just to read through. Some of them are hilarious. All of this talk is about what traps are for and what they can do, but we haven't talked about how to make them because really, I don't have any advice on that. If I think a trap is a good idea, I just make one up. Otherwise, I rely on books like the Book of Challenges. I've linked a lot of other 5th edition products in the doobly-doo that might scratch that same itch. You can check them out, but I haven't used them, so I can't vouch for them. That's it, folks. That's the video on traps. You can use them to keep your players on their toes and remind them the world is a dangerous place and that these ancient structures had their own past and history before the bad guys took over. You can use them to ratchet up the tension in an otherwise passive encounter and create a sense of drama and a ticking clock. You can use them to separate the heroes in an encounter so they can't bring all of their resources to bear at the same time. Or they can be an encounter all on their own with unique challenges and crazy complications. Next video? I don't know, but now that we've covered traps, the next most common question I get from new DMs, which we haven't already covered, is how to award experience, which is pretty simple, but worth a video. Also, I forgot to wish my friend Dale a happy birthday. You all know Dale because she makes dope D&D videos and Greek myth videos, and Wizards of the Coast did her a solid and released a D&D setting in their version of Fantasy Greece, which Dale released her own supplement for, Heroes and Villains of Theros. It's on the DMs Guild. It's highly reviewed. Check it out. Happy birthday, Dale. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you want to get an alert when we release a new video, you gotta ring the little bell icon down there. If you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon, which we are developing some exclusive content for. And we have a store where we just added all of the non-exclusive minis from the Kickstarter, where you can see their models in these super cool 3D turnarounds. So awesome. Man, it's like we're a real company with this stuff. These are just pre-orders, though. They ship next year. Until next time, folks, peace out.